I grew up being obsessed with 21 Pilots. I remember a time when Vessel and Self-Titled were the only 21 Pilots albums in existence. It always comes back to the shows 21 Pilots does a mean and nasty live show. The gigs are fun and exciting and masterfully choreographed. They're endlessly creative. The only downside is that these shows tend to be a hotspot for weirdos. I've spoken bluntly on this in the past. When you are a band or a TV show and you rely heavily on themes of mental illness, self-actualization, community, add a little dash of structure like rules and hierarchy, lore, maybe an ARG for good measure. That is a potent lure for weird teenagers. And good. Weird teenagers are awesome. Finding weird intellectual properties to staple into your soul to form an identity is kind of part of growing up. And I think 21 Pilots is one of the better, more wholesome bands that you could sell your soul to when you're 14 years old. It's just the thing is, it is not supposed to be a forever thing, you know? You are supposed to eventually grow and develop and form yourself outside of the artists, you know? You're supposed to embark on your own journey of self-actualization using the artist as a springboard. It's literally all over 21 Pilots lyrics. You have Tyler Joseph asking you to think for yourself, to make art that only you understand, that whole power to the local dreamer thing they were doing for a bit. Sometimes you see people in their 20s and there is a sense of desperation and angst. It's one thing to be obsessed with a band when you're in high school, but it's a whole other thing when you're a tax-paying adult. Is there nothing else going on in your world that this is still the thing that you are completely wholeheartedly obsessed with? A lot of the times, they don't have anywhere else in the world that they are a source of authority and control and stability, you know? So to bring us home, this ties back to 21 Pilots shows. There are different phases to shows. There are different hierarchies of people involved with the shows. There are different events that transpire, and there are different consequences involved with those events. It's all a little silly, it's definitely a bit convoluted, and it's also way too important to a lot of folks, too. I think this is actually kind of interesting. Let's dig into it a little bit. The before section of a 21 Pilots show is either the most fun part of the whole experience or the worst part. There is literally no in between. A moth got into my room. Get out of here, buddy. Folks will generally camp out in front of the venue, assume that they are in general admission. The primary objective of the whole thing is to be as close to the front as possible. Unfortunately, this band has over 30 million monthly listeners on Spotify alone, so if you want to get to the front of one of these shows, you have to commit some kind of war crimes, you know? There are always going to be tens of thousands of weirdos more desperate than you are to get to that barricade. Some people are trying to get around this by camping for 10 days in advance for a show. The problem is most venues just do not let you loiter for 10 days at a time, you know? You can't just do that, you know? You're gonna get the police called on you. So some folks are taking to Reddit and Twitter, and they are calling themselves line leaders. What a line leader will do is they will set up a check-in spot. Sometimes it is in parking garages, sometimes it is in city parks, sometimes it is across the street from the venue on a little grassy patch right there. Everybody kind of does it differently. There's no uniform way of doing so based on what I've seen and gathered. Basically, you check in with the self-appointed line leaders and they will give you a number or a wristband and they will hold your spot in an imaginary line. The line leader cop will check in and make sure that everybody is where they need to be. Eventually, the big day comes. It's the day of the show. You know, everyone's been waiting for this. The line is finally allowed to officially form in front of the venue. And once that happens, the imaginary line that was made behind the scenes just slots into place perfectly and there are no problems whatsoever. From what I'm reading, that's actually not really how it goes half the time. Let's say hypothetically that you are a normal person. You are excited for this concert and so you do something crazy. You wake up at 4 a.m. and you are at the venue at 5 a.m., you know, the day of the show. You are lucky enough to find yourself first in line. You are standing right there and the door is in front of you. And then one of these people, probably somebody 22, bright purple hair or something like that. They walk up to you and they say, hey, actually, I'm in front of you. For the past 10 days, we have been doing a totally separate line. And so there's actually 140 people ahead of you. Do you think that's realistic? Obviously, you are a person with more than 3 brain cells. So you look at the line leader and you say, actually, your imaginary line is over there. I'm right here. This is the venue's day of the show. The doors are right there. There's not 140 people in front of me, so I'm not exactly buying the fact that there is. The line leader gets a little bit flustered and they say, well, the thing is the venue won't allow us to line up until the day of the show. You are smart. You think to yourself, well, it is the day of the show and the venue is now allowing people to properly line up. And since I'm in the front of the line, at the end of the day, it's the venue hosting the show. So they call the shots. They don't recognize your line. They recognize this line. And I'm at the front of this line. And then Twitter stands up and they all applaud. In case it's not apparent, this is all really silly. It is silly to watch fully grown adults take a week off of work or anything else they have going on to sit and wait for like a week in advance for a 2-hour show. It is silly to watch fully grown adults try to constitute some semblance of law and order, presuming that they know fully well that the system that they are inventing on the spot is going to be trampled by the official laws that be by the actual venue hosting the event once the chips fall the day of the show. You know, people on Twitter have been taking it upon themselves to contact the venues that these shows are taking place at and asking them, hey, are you actually going to honor these like lines that are forming 10 days in advance? And every single time the venue's like, no, we are not going to honor that because that's really silly. Imagine being the 22-year-old with bright purple hair trying to explain to Gus, the security guard, about this secret tent cult that her and her friends started across the street in the park, and they had their own elected officials and their own check-in systems, and then try to understand why Gus, the security guard, just does not understand why her and her 140 friends should cut in front of the people who are already physically in front of the door. It's not happening. Gus says they're there fair and square. If you've been camping out for 10 days, why are these people in front of you? That does not give you the rights to harass these people who are actually right here, who followed venue rules and are doing it correctly. This early camping stuff is getting really, really silly. Plus the entitlement and hostility that is bred out of waiting in line for 2 weeks for something like this, that cannot be understated. The more you invest in experience, the more you expect to get out of it. If you're investing 2 weeks of your time and blood and sweat and tears into an event, and then you finally get to the door and there's like 40 people ahead of you, what kind of response do you think those people are going to have? A mentally ill 20-something-year-old is going to go absolutely crazy. And that's a shame because like the line is supposed to be kind of fun. Most of the friends that I talk to at least like once a week, I met in line for 21 Pilots. My best friend in the world, who I wrote my first album, The Denton Weaver, about, I met in line waiting for 21 Pilots. When I was 15, I attended a date during the Blurryface tour in a room that only had like 2,000 capacity. It was really small. I skipped school and I joined line about like 4 a.m. in the morning that day. There was already like 30 people ahead of me, but I was still pretty happy. I packed a suitcase, there was an Xbox, and I also packed my old little TV, and we played like Halo in line. It was amazing. We all held each other's place in line. We took shifts. We went to go get food. We went to the bathroom. We did like stuff that we needed to do, etc. And we like respected and supported each other back like 10 years ago. It was a beautiful, incredible time. And it was actually one of the best, most beautiful experiences of my teenage years. But that's because I put a proportional amount of effort into the payoff at the end. I did not allow the 21 Pilots show become a life or death struggle. It was just like a one-day commitment. And so by the time that the show actually came around, I was happy to be there. I had made new friends. I had wonderful, amazing experiences, etc., etc. All my friends and I got in. We were on the floor. We had a phenomenal time. The show was fantastic. I was lucky enough to see the emotional road show from the barricade, that part in Trees, where the two band members of 21 Pilots climb on top of the audience and then they like bang drums and stuff like that. It was my hand, it was my fingers that Tyler Joseph like laced his fingers inside of, and then he like put all of his body weight on top of mine and he hoisted himself onto the audience, and then he like stood on top of a platform and then he played drums. I had one hand underneath the drum, I had one hand underneath the platform. Tyler Joseph was playing on top of me. It was a concert experience that I will never forget in my entire life. I waited in line for that. It was the day of the show. It was fantastic. I did not need to camp for 10 days. That's just silly. I look at the people who are calling themselves line leaders and they are putting all this effort and thought into organizing something that they feel is fair, and then when the chips finally fall and the day of reckoning finally arrives and this whole thing that they've poured all their efforts into is not recognized by the powers that be, they'll get mad, they'll get upset. Something in my soul wonders, is this all that they have going on? Do they not have anything else that they can like pour their time and efforts into? This is kind of sad and embarrassing, right? Years of listening, months of planning, weeks of camping, all to come crumbling down once Gus, the security guard, drops the news that the venue just does not give a hoot about this special imaginary land that they just made up on the spot. Now, realistically, once the doors open, all that structure and time and thought will just go flying out the door. The special rules and expectations, they will melt away before your very eyes. Things are going to go awry when your security line gets stuck while the next one is flying right past you. Order disappears when your line realizes that the venue actually has 3 other entrances and you are now being surpassed by people who just showed up on the spot. At a 21 Pilots show, the one thing that truly matters is your placement in the pit. How close are you to the stage? Are you going to be one of the people supporting the bandmates when they are standing on top of the audience performing? What is your line of sight going to be like, you know? All of the chaos that you experienced beforehand was all in service of allocating your spot as to where you are during the actual show in the crowd. I mean, that's what it's all there for, right? Where are you in the room? Because that is the only thing that actually matters. This is where a whole other set of issues arise, the experience of actually being in the crowd. When you have tens of thousands of mentally ill, exhausted, dehydrated kids with sensory issues crammed like sardines on their feet for 5 hours, conflict is bound to happen somewhere, you know. You are gonna get some 15-year-olds just covering their heads and demanding 2 feet of personal space in a sold-out room where you physically have nowhere else to go. You'll be scolded for bumping into someone after you're accidentally pushed into them by a stranger. You're going to have folks just tapping on your shoulder, demanding that they stand in front of you because you are slightly taller than they are. These are all attempts being made by people who are desperate for this experience to be perfect for them, even if it is at your expense. The anticipation for a show like this just cannot be understated. But any slight variable that poses a slight threat to the optimal enjoyment of the night is an existential crisis that absolutely needs to be addressed. You gotta understand that sometimes with the physical age of a lot of people who attend these shows, there's gonna be a dissatisfaction to the fact that these events are going to be inherently chaotic for almost everybody involved. You can try to build an imaginary line that guarantees your spot at the front of the line, but the day of the show can come and security will decide that that just absolutely does not matter. You can try and introduce all of these rules and expectations to provide some semblance of order to this whole experience, but the second that those rules or expectations provide any semblance of inconvenience to anybody else, those rules are going out the window. You can ask folks to give you space, but there's not a lot that you can do when you're arguing against the will of a mindless mass of flesh and sweat operating purely out of consequence of millions of tiny little decisions and actions being made subconsciously by all of the beings comprising it, also affected by it as well. I am making this video right now because I'm actually very fascinated by the humanity of 21 Pilots fans and what they go through at a concert for 21 Pilots. I think that there is something just universally relatable about fighting against the forces of entropy and chaos and trying to push some semblance of order into those things, you know? I think it's cute for human beings to try and make something out of something absolutely crazy. You can spend 10 days camped out across the street from the venue and still be beaten out by folks who just happened to show up that morning before you did, following venue rules, just like how you can spend your entire life practicing and learning and educating yourself to become a mechanic only to have your hands crushed at the age of 22. You can work really hard and find yourself like maybe 2 or 3 layers behind the barricade during a 21 Pilots show, totally happy with where you are, only to have some 6'4" white guy walk and stand directly in front of you halfway through the show, despite the fact that you've been waiting there since 4 a.m. and they just got here 20 minutes ago and they pushed the way to the front. Just like how you can work a nice paying job your entire life and have a beautiful house only for it to catch on fire halfway through your 50s and lose absolutely everything that you've worked your entire life for. You can spend months waiting in wild anticipation for what you hope is going to be the ultimate catharsis in the form of a concert, an hour and a half that will reaffirm every aspect of your life, your identity, the nights colored by the songs that you hope to be performed before your very eyes, only for the disappointment to set in that as amazing as this live show is, it will never be better than the time you were listening to these songs in your car with your best friend driving alone in the middle of the night with the stars above you, reflecting on how fortunate you are to be sharing this one individual moment in the same place at the same time, wondering and considering statistically how much of an anomaly it is that you are anything at all. You are hyping yourself up with the expectation to see the face of God, only to see something absolutely unexpected and out of your control. Are you going to feel sad that it's not everything that you ever imagined? Or are you going to be mature and love it for what it is? Part of growing up is tampering your expectations. This does not need to be sad. This does not need to be an act of cynicism. This can actually be liberating and freeing. It is important that you don't feel disappointed by the lack of a perfect concert, but rather that you feel happy for seeing a great concert. Desire and comparison are the ultimate thieves of joy. You need to look at this as a glass half full type of situation. The strange politics of a 21 Pilots show is so much more than just weirdos on Twitter and Reddit. It is a reflection of what everybody everywhere doing everything is going through. You need to practice gratitude. You absolutely need to live and let live. I think that you should hold your place in line and not let the weirdos in the tent cult take your place. You gotta breathe easy and assume that the person bumping into you is not doing so because they just don't care about your comfort, but rather because they were pushed by something completely out of their control. Assume ignorance over hostility, you know? And when your time inevitably comes and you face down the ultimate fate and consequence of all the struggle, conflict, suffering, and effort you've been through, you gotta keep your expectations in check because you're probably not gonna see heaven. But that's okay, because this faith that you're experiencing is a faith that's being shared by everybody and everyone around you all at once. Right now. Because at the end of the day, isn't it all bigger than just the final destination? It's the friends you make, it's the stories that you gather, and the things you collect that you cannot take to the other side that are the really important stuff. That's what everything is about, right? Or you could just buy a f***ing seat and not deal with all this bullshit, right? I cannot emphasize to you enough how much better my life has been since I've just quit bothering with GA pits and just bought chairs at arena shows. You don't need to go through all this.